There is a version of the introvert that no one talks about, not the misunderstood genius and not the quiet sage. It's the one who shut themselves away so completely that they became an island surrounded by an invisible wall, untouchable even to the person who sleeps beside them every night. Have you ever felt this way? Have you noticed that you stopped replying to messages, stopped accepting invitations, and called it growth when maybe it was something else? Have you realized that your silence, once a choice, became a layer you no longer know how to cross? Carl Jung saw this in decades of clinical practice. In his work Psychological Types, published in 1921, he mapped out this dark territory of the human soul and described what happens when your inner life stops being a sanctuary and becomes a prison. Before Jung, most scientists and philosophers looked at quiet people with suspicion, as if something was broken in them. Jung changed that narrative. He showed that some people's psychic energy, what he called libido in a broad sense, naturally turns inward. There is no flaw in that. It's just a different orientation of the soul. The introvert is someone who needs the inner world the same way others need the outer one. They are fueled by contemplation, stillness, and the long listening they do inside themselves. That is the healthy introvert. But there is another kind. There is the one who started out contemplative and then closed off more than they should have. The one who mistook withdrawal for depth. The one who stopped speaking, not because they had too much to say, but because they no longer believed anyone was listening. That is the dark introvert. And that is who we are going to talk about now. Not to judge them, but to understand them. Because maybe you know them. Maybe you are them. Maybe you are just afraid of becoming them. I know this is hard to hear, especially for those who have always found their last safe place in silence. The outside world isn't always kind to souls who think too much. There's a unique kind of exhaustion that comes from having to explain your own way of being from an early age. The child who preferred reading to playing. The teenager who felt drained after parties that others loved. The adult who walks into a crowded office and feels like every exchanged word costs a piece of energy that takes hours to come back. For these people, silence isn't a luxury. It's survival. The problem is that when survival becomes a habit, it stops being survival and turns into a life sentence. This reclusive introvert is someone who learned early that the world hurts and so built a shelter inside themselves. At first, that shelter is beautiful. It has windows, books, thoughts. But over time, the windows get closed. Books start to replace people. Thoughts start to circle around themselves, going nowhere. And then, without realizing it, the shelter becomes a cell. Jung would say this is what happens when the libido turns excessively toward the subject, completely ignoring the object. The psyche loses the counterbalance of the outside world and starts to consume itself. The Jungian definition of introversion is actually simpler than it seems. Jung said that the introvert directs their psychic energy toward the subject, that is, toward themselves. The extrovert, in contrast, directs their energy toward the object, toward what is outside. Neither is better than the other. Both are legitimate ways of existing. The problem is that the structural logic of modern life pushes everyone to an extreme. You are either too performative or too reclusive. Almost no one lives in the middle. And the introvert, who already has a natural tendency inward, finds in today's social setup a permanent excuse to go deeper and deeper. The ability to work alone from your own room has become the norm for millions of people. The screen has replaced presence. Where there used to be a voice call, now a typed and sent message is enough. Every new tool in the market dynamic gives them another way to avoid needing others. And they accept it. They accept it because it hurts less. But what they don't realize is that what hurts less doesn't always heal more. Sometimes what hurts less is just the shortest path to deep wear and tear. Jung called this the one-sidedness of the psyche. This phenomenon of developing in only one direction. When the soul only develops inward, it loses the creative tension that comes from confronting the outside. And without that tension, it stagnates. It stops growing. It just digs deeper into the same spot, like a drill boring the same hole until it finds nothing but rock. The birth of the dark introvert almost always has an ancient origin. It's not an adult choice, it's a childhood response. At some point in that soul's history, the outside world proved too dangerous. It could have been early rejection, a distant father, an absent mother, a cruel school, a group of peers who mocked some vulnerability. It could have been an unspoken wound, one of those no one sees, the kind that stays buried in deep layers and shapes how that child learns to protect themselves. And the protection they choose is almost always withdrawal. If the world hurts, then the world must be avoided. If people disappoint, then people must be kept at a distance. If expression invites punishment, then expression must be swallowed. And so, day after day, year after year, the child builds an increasingly sophisticated emotional fortress. The danger is that this fortress designed to protect ends up trapping them. The adult they become can no longer leave. They no longer know how to speak without filtering every word. They no longer know how to give themselves over without calculating the risk. They no longer know how to love without suspicion. Everything in them has become calculation, defense, anticipation of pain. And the worst part is that they believe this is maturity. They believe they have just learned how the world works. But Jung would show that it's not. That this isn't maturity. This is an unconscious compensation that has crystallized, turned into personality, turned into identity, turned into a prison. Think of a child who learns at age 7 that crying invites mockery, that asking to be held invites annoyance, that showing enthusiasm invites correction. That child doesn't rationally decide to stop feeling, they just learn, wordlessly, that the safest path is to contract. And that contraction becomes posture, posture becomes body, body becomes history. 20 years later, that adult no longer remembers any of those specific moments. But their body remembers. Their breath shortens when someone gets too close. Their shoulders lift when someone asks a direct question. Their voice drops when someone asks them to stand up for themselves. All of this is memory. Memory that became muscle. Memory that became a way of existing. I completely understand if you recognize yourself in this description. It's uncomfortable. But recognizing is the first move. Because as long as this kind of introvert doesn't see themselves, they can't free themselves. They think they are just being themselves. But much of what they call being themselves is actually an old response to an old pain. It's not essence, it's scar tissue. And scar tissue can be cared for. Silence is one of the most powerful tools a human being has. The contemplative monks knew this. The ancient philosophers knew this. Jung knew this. There is a kind of stillness that is fertile, that prepares the soul for deep insights, that allows the unconscious to whisper truths that hurried speech could never reach. But there is another kind. The withdrawal of this crystallized introvert is not fertile, it's sterile. They are not quiet because they are listening to their inner world. They are quiet because they have given up on the outer world. Those are radically different things. When silence comes from contemplation, it expands the one who practices it. The quiet person becomes more sensitive, more perceptive, more connected to the subtle layers of existence. But when stillness comes from disbelief, it shrinks the one who practices it. The person starts to see every conversation as a waste. They start to think other people's words are shallow, repetitive, offensive in their banality. And then they stop replying, stop showing up, stop offering their presence. They become that quiet uncle at the family dinner, that coworker who eats alone, that friend who disappeared without explanation, not out of malice, but because for them speaking became so costly that it was easier to just leave. The silence that was armor became a wall. And the worst thing about walls is that they don't distinguish between friends and enemies. Everything from the outside is blocked equally. The dark introvert starts to lose even the connections that once mattered to them. Old friends disappear because they don't reply. Family members pull away because they won't open up. Romantic partners give up because they never say what they feel. And they stay inside, in the fortress, thinking the problem is everyone else, thinking the world is the one that's distant, when in truth, they are the one who stops showing up. Emotional coldness then appears as the most visible symptom of this journey. People look at this withdrawn introvert and say they are cold, that they have no feelings, that they seem insensitive, and sometimes they believe this about themselves. But Jung had a crucial observation about this point, one that few people know. In the ego and the unconscious, he shows that what is not expressed consciously does not disappear. It just moves into the unconscious. And there, in the unconscious, this repressed material accumulates, ferments, gains strength. The apparent coldness of this kind of introvert is not emptiness. It's excess. It's a volcano that has learned to disguise itself as a glacier. Inside, that man or woman may be burning. They may be carrying accumulated anger that never found a target. They may be carrying unspoken love that weighs like a stone at the bottom of their chest. There may be old longing for someone who left without warning, and resentment they don't even know where it came from. But none of this finds a way out. None of it is translated into words, gestures, tears. It all stays dammed up, and damning emotion, ultimately, is damning life. Those who dam too much begin to corrode from the inside. Unspoken emotions become chronic tension in the body, that headache that always comes back at the same time, that insomnia no tea can fix, that fatigue that sleep never seems to undo. Modern neuroscience confirms what Jung already intuited. Studies on alexithymia, which is the difficulty in recognizing and expressing emotions, show that people who chronically repress their feelings have higher rates of chronic somatic symptoms and various physical imbalances throughout life. The body collects the bill that the soul refused to pay, and this introvert, without knowing it, is paying that bill every day. Every swallowed emotion is a small accumulated debt, and eventually that debt comes due. There is also an effect that few people notice. When someone dams up emotion for too long, they start to lose the ability to identify what they are feeling. The feeling is still there, active in the body, stirring the nervous system, altering internal chemistry. But consciousness can no longer translate it into words. The person just feels a vague unease, a diffuse tension, a nameless irritation. And because they can't name it, they can't treat it. The emotion wanders inside the organism with no destination, no expression, fueling a chronic suffering that seems to have no origin, but it does have an origin. The origin is every moment they swallowed what needed to be said. Every tear that was suppressed made room for another that was also swallowed the next day. All of it remains inside, alive, demanding a way out that was never offered. And there is a name for that part of us that we insist on not looking at. Jung called the shadow everything that the ego rejects in itself and pushes into the unconscious. The shadow is not absolute evil. It is just the part of us we don't want to see. It can contain terrible things, but it can also contain wonderful things. It all depends on what that individual learned to reject in themselves. In the reclusive introvert, the shadow often contains exactly what they despised in extroverts their whole life. The spontaneity they learned to call immaturity, the loud joy they labeled shallow, the exposed vulnerability they came to interpret as weakness, and even deeper, that basic desire to be seen and loved, which they learned to hide from themselves because it seemed too humiliating to admit. All of these dimensions, which they learned to consider weak, were pushed into the unconscious. But they are still there, still alive, still asking for passage. And the more they deny them, the more they grow. The more they pride themselves on not needing anyone, the more their unconscious screams for the connection they refuse to seek. The rejected shadow does not disappear. It just becomes more powerful in secret. And eventually, it emerges. It emerges in the form of inexplicable outbursts of anger, the kind where the person is startled by their own reaction to something trivial. It emerges in unconscious obsessions with people who seem to have exactly what they denied in themselves. It emerges in disturbing dreams. It emerges in compulsive behaviors they can't explain, and in long periods of dense melancholy that seem to come from nowhere. This introvert is bewildered when these signs appear, because they have gotten used to seeing themselves as controlled, rational, above passion. But the passions never left. They just went down to the basement. And a basement that gets too full will eventually overflow. I'm not saying this to distress you, but to wake you up. Because waking up is the only way to stop living asleep inside yourself. And that is exactly what the dark introvert does. They live asleep inside themselves, thinking they are awake to the world. The difference between real depth and sick isolation is that real depth expands, while sick isolation shrinks. Ask yourself honestly, in the last few years, has your inner life been expanding you or shrinking you? Are you learning more about yourself or just repeating the same thoughts with different words? Another dangerous trait that appears in this process is silent arrogance. This type of introvert often begins to develop a sense of superiority. They look at more social people and think they are shallow. They look at those who laugh at parties and think those people have no inner life. They look at casual conversation and consider it all a waste of time. They start to see themselves as special, deeper, more sensitive, more aware. And worse, they start to feel that this superiority justifies their isolation. Jung had a precise term for this. He called it ego inflation. It happens when the individual, by disconnecting from the external world, loses the humble reference that comes from contact with others. Without that contact, the ego begins to inflate disproportionately. It starts to identify with elevated archetypes, like the sage, the philosopher, the enlightened one, and this identification creates a dangerous illusion. The person stops seeing themselves as an ordinary human being on a journey of growth and starts to see themselves as someone who has already arrived somewhere special. When in truth, they haven't arrived anywhere. They just moved away from everywhere else. This arrogance is particularly seductive because it fuels isolation with a noble excuse. I'm not alone because no one wants me, the inflated ego says. I'm alone because no one can reach me. It is a much more comfortable story than admitting the simple truth that they are afraid. Afraid to expose themselves, afraid of not being loved, afraid of discovering that maybe they are just ordinary and not the misunderstood genius their mind has built. If you are enjoying this content, check out in the first comment our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. There, we dive even deeper into these psychic processes that Jung left us as a legacy and that remain more relevant than ever. There comes a point in the trajectory where something definitive breaks. The moment when this introvert becomes truly unreachable. Those who loved them try and try again. But they keep hitting the same invisible wall. They reply to messages, yes. They show up at family gatherings, yes. They fulfill their professional duties, yes. But something is missing, something no one can name. It's as if their shell is there, but the core left for somewhere else a long time ago. Romantic partners feel this in a particularly cruel way. They sleep next to them, but feel like they are sleeping next to an island. They talk to them, but feel like they are talking to a closed door. They ask them to open up, and they say they are open. But the openness they offer is such a narrow crack that nothing substantial gets through. Over time, these partners give up. They leave or they stay physically, but leave emotionally. And instead of taking this as a call to change, the introvert often interprets the other's departure as confirmation that people, even the closest ones, are not trustworthy. One more excuse to close off even more. It's a tragic cycle. Each new loss feeds the belief that caused the previous losses. Each new withdrawal reinforces the justification for staying withdrawn. And they grow older inside this logic, not realizing that with each passing year, the wall gets higher, and they themselves become more unable to tear it down. There comes a point where they wouldn't even know how to open up even if they wanted to. They forgot how. Think of a 50-year-old man looking at an old photograph from the time when he still laughed easily, still called friends without needing a reason, still cried at movies. He looks at that photograph and barely recognizes the person there, not because he has aged physically, but because something essential has been erased. And he doesn't know when it happened. It was too gradual to have a date. It was too subtle to have a name. It was just a slow slide from everything spontaneous toward everything contained. And now, even wanting to go back, he no longer knows the way. The roads that led to that way of existing have been overgrown. The bridges are in ruins. The original territory still exists somewhere, but the map is lost. The relationship with the outside world at this stage becomes frankly toxic. Everything from the outside is interpreted as a threat, an interruption, a waste. A phone call is an invasion. An unexpected visit is a violation. A demand at work starts to feel like a violation of personal boundaries. People in general become problems to be managed, not human beings to be met. And this introvert withdraws more and more, thinking this is self-care. But Jung would say this is not self-care. True self-care includes the other, includes the world, includes the necessary discomfort of real encounter. What this kind of recluse calls self-care is actually atrophy of the soul. The human psyche, like any living system, needs stimulation to stay healthy. It needs contact with what is different from itself to better know itself. Without that external counterpoint, it does not develop. It only conserves itself, like a muscle that stops being used and starts to lose mass. There is a very interesting biological process called disuse atrophy. When a person stays in bed for a long time without using their muscles, those muscles begin to shrink and lose strength. No matter how much they eat, how much they rest, without use, the muscle disappears. The psyche works in a similar way. Without confrontation with the outside, it atrophies. Social skills, empathic ability, emotional flexibility, all of this gradually disappears. And this introvert wakes up one day realizing they no longer know how to talk to people, that they feel awkward in any social setting, that they have even lost basic emotional vocabulary. But instead of seeking rehabilitation, they use this as yet another justification to stay isolated. That's just how I am, they say. No, you became this way, and you can become something else too. Jung noticed something curious about those who dive too deeply into their own world. He called it archetypal identification. Archetypes are universal patterns of the human psyche, present in every culture, every mythology, every spiritual tradition. There is the hero archetype who faces the impossible, the mother who nurtures, the sage who guides. And there are many others, including the hermit, which is precisely the one that most seduces those who have isolated themselves too much. These archetypes are neutral in themselves. They offer structures that the individual psyche can partially embody. But the problem starts when someone stops partially embodying an archetype and becomes totally identified with it. Then the person loses their individual humanity and becomes a caricature of the myth. This introvert often identifies with the hermit archetype or the solitary genius. They start to live as if they are a character in a novel, with all the aesthetics of isolation, all the romanticized melancholy, all the performative depth. They might even read books that reinforce this character, adopt habits that fit the image, talk about themselves in those terms. But all of this is a mask, a rigid persona they wear to avoid facing who they really are underneath. The difference between embodying an archetype in a healthy way and being possessed by it is that in the first case, the person remains flexible, able to take on other forms as life demands. In the second case, the person becomes frozen. They become that character all the time. They can no longer step out of the skin they put on. And this rigidity is a subtle form of internal erasure. You still breathe, but you no longer change. You still exist, but you no longer live. There is a critical moment in this journey, and perhaps it has already happened for you who are listening to this. It is the moment when this introvert realizes that the silence they chose has become just an echo of nothing, but all the deep thinking they cultivated is no longer taking them anywhere. That they are just spinning in ever smaller circles, inside the same head, repeating the same conclusions. The abyss they once explored turned out to have a bottom, and the bottom is empty. Friedrich Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, left one of the most remembered lines in all of philosophy. He said that he who fights with monsters should be careful not to become a monster himself. And he added something even more unsettling. When you stare long into an abyss, the abyss also stares into you. Jung would deeply agree. Those who dive too deep into their own unconscious without bringing light into it get swallowed by it. This withdrawn introvert is not just living inside themselves. At some point, they were devoured by the self they thought they were inhabiting. This is a crucial distinction. Inhabiting yourself is one thing. Being devoured by yourself is another. Inhabiting requires awareness, requires healthy inner dialogue, requires movement. Being devoured is passive, it's falling, it's surrendering to chaos without direction. Many of these introverts think they are inhabiting the depth of their own soul, when in fact, they are being slowly consumed by it. The human psyche, when it becomes too one-sided, always generates neurosis. Jung repeated this idea in several of his works. Neurosis, in his language, is not a moral weakness. It is an imbalance between psychic forces. When one part of the psyche is overdeveloped and another is abandoned, suffering arises. And that suffering is not punishment. It is a call. It is the unconscious trying to make itself heard. In this crystallized introvert, the unconscious, after years of being ignored, begins to invade consciousness chaotically. Anxiety appears for no apparent reason, the kind that tightens the chest in the middle of the most routine day. Recurring nightmares start to repeat as if carrying coded messages. Acute bouts of anguish explode in everyday moments at the supermarket, in the car, before sleeping. Prolonged melancholic states settle in for long periods with no identifiable cause. Physical symptoms with no clear medical explanation start to appear. All of this is the unconscious collecting the bill for decades of neglect. All of this is the shadow demanding to be recognized. And here's the cruel paradox. This introvert, who spent their life running from the pain the outside world might bring, ends up creating a much greater pain inside themselves. Because pain that comes from outside can be managed by pulling away. But pain that comes from inside has nowhere to run. It is inside. It is part of them. And continuing to run from it is running from themselves, which is literally impossible. That's why many end up deeply exhausted. Not from weakness, but because the entire system has broken its inner balance. There is a mirror this introvert avoids looking into. They think they know themselves very well because they think about themselves a lot. But Jung made a crucial distinction between rumination and individuation. Rumination is mentally repeating the same stories about yourself, the same grievances, the same justifications, the same self-explanatory theories. Rumination is spinning around your own axis. Individuation, on the other hand, is movement. It is confrontation. It is bringing to light what was hidden. It is truly looking at the shadow, not just the ego's version that thinks it's deep. The reclusive introvert ruminates. They do not individuate. They have theories about themselves, but rarely the courage to see themselves. They have analyses of others, but avoid analyses of their own contradictions. They can talk about their pain in abstract terms, but freeze when they need to name concrete feelings. They can diagnose the world but cannot diagnose themselves. This is the greatest deception of this crystallized introversion, the illusion of deep self-knowledge, when in fact, there is only an elaborate defense against real self-knowledge. Looking at the shadow hurts. Truly looking, without disguise, without rationalization, hurts a lot. It means admitting your own pettiness, your own childish fears, your own unmet needs, your own weaknesses that the ego refused to accept. It means letting go of the self-image as someone special, deep, superior. It means discovering that, deep down, you are just as human as everyone else. And that shared humanity is exactly what this introvert fears most, because it knocks them off the lonely pedestal where they have taken refuge. It is completely valid to feel resistance to this idea. Every soul that has built a fortress feels fear when someone suggests tearing it down. But Jung, who dedicated his entire life to studying this journey, had a concrete proposal. He called it individuation. And it is in this concept that the way out lies for those who have withdrawn too far. Individuation, in the Jungian sense, is not about becoming an extrovert. It is not about giving up depth. It is not about turning into someone who loves parties and crowds. It is something much more subtle and much more powerful. Individuation is the process by which the individual integrates all parts of their own psyche, reconciling conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, inner masculine and feminine, light and darkness. It is a process of wholeness, not superficial change. The introvert in the process of individuation does not betray their nature. They complete it. They remain someone who loves silence but learn to break it when silence starts to suffocate. They remain someone deep but learn that real depth includes the other, doesn't exclude them. They remain someone reflective but learn that reflection must at some point become action, expression, encounter, otherwise it becomes just sterile thought spinning around itself. Jung had a phrase that might be the most important in all his work for those on this journey. He said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is especially true for the dark introvert. They spent their life imagining an idealized version of themselves, a deep self, a superior self, a self beyond the pettiness of the world. But that imagination did not save them. On the contrary, it trapped them even more. The real path is the opposite. It is to look into the darkness, to recognize the shadow, to admit the wounds that originated the isolation, to find the child who was rejected and give them the warmth they never received, to identify the fears disguised as personality, to distinguish what is true essence from what is crystallized defense. This work is painful, but it is the only thing that truly sets you free. The first step is smaller than anyone imagines. It starts with small acts of courage, answering the phone when you normally wouldn't, saying a true sentence about what you are feeling, even if your voice trembles, accepting an invitation you always refuse, allowing someone into your home, your day, your emotion, without putting up the immediate defense. Each small act like this is a brick removed from the wall. And walls, even the highest ones, are made of bricks. Remove one, remove another, remove one more, and one day the light starts to get in again. Another practical path Jung recommended was working with dreams. The unconscious speaks through dreams. Every dream is a message, a compensation, an alert, a direction. This reclusive introvert, who usually dismisses this dimension as irrational, should start writing down their dreams upon waking. Observe the recurring symbols, the figures that appear, the settings that repeat. This is a form of dialogue with the part of the psyche they have been ignoring. You don't need to interpret everything immediately. Just start paying attention. That alone changes the relationship with the unconscious. Another essential practice is what Jung called active imagination, a technique he developed personally during his own confrontation with the unconscious. It involves sitting in silence, letting images emerge spontaneously, and mentally dialoguing with those images as if they were real characters. For those who have isolated themselves too much, this practice can be transformative because it allows access to psychic contents that defensive rationality normally blocks. The figures that appear in this process often bring valuable messages about what is asking to be integrated. And then there is the simplest work, but perhaps the hardest, naming what you feel out loud to someone you trust. It could be a therapist, a close friend, an available family member. The act of turning emotion into words and words into shared sound has an unlocking effect that no solitary reflection can achieve. It's as if the emotion, upon being heard by another human being, finally finds the way out it had been looking for decades. Reconnecting with the external world does not mean losing yourself in it. That is the central fear of the dark introvert, and it is a legitimate fear. They have seen people who gave themselves too much to the world and lost themselves. But there is a middle path, and that is precisely the path of individuation. The healed introvert does not become a performative partygoer or a compulsive follower of everything outside. They learn to inhabit two territories at once: the inside and the outside, depth and presence, fertile silence and honest speech. They learn, above all, that vulnerability is not weakness. This lesson is probably the hardest. For someone who has spent their entire life protecting themselves, the idea of exposure feels unbearable. But vulnerability is the gateway to any real connection. Without it, all relationships are just functional exchanges. With it, relationships gain depth. And the introvert, ironically, discovers that the depth they so sought alone only fully reveals itself in encounter with another. Solitude has its value. No one is saying you need to be surrounded by people all the time. The great mystics, the great philosophers, the great artists needed long periods of retreat to create their work. But all of them, at some point, came back. They reappeared in the world. They encountered the other again. They rejoined the community that had waited for them. Their withdrawal was strategic, not permanent. It was a phase, not an identity. And that is the difference between the healthy introvert and the reclusive introvert who has crystallized. One withdraws in order to come back with more to offer. The other withdraws to never come back and loses themselves in the process. The final choice is always in the hands of the one walking this journey. All the depth of the introvert can be their greatest gift, or it can be their greatest curse. It depends on what they do with it. Silence can be wisdom that prepares great works, or it can be a prison that suffocates all possible work. Coldness can be a healthy boundary that protects what is essential, or it can be a fading of inner life. Solitude can be a sanctuary, or it can be a psychuary, or it can be a silent chamber with no return. It all depends on the awareness with which each person inhabits their inner world. And that is exactly why Jung insisted so much on individuation, because it is the process that transforms potential into realization, that prevents depth from becoming an abyss, that keeps silence fertile instead of sterile, that integrates the shadow instead of being dominated by it, that puts the ego in its proper place without inflation and without annihilation, that returns to the individual their shared humanity without them losing their uniqueness. Maybe you see yourself in pieces of this description. Maybe you feel you have already walked too far in the dark direction and are afraid you can't turn back. I completely understand if you feel that way. But there is one thing Jung made clear throughout his work. It is never too late to start integrating. The human psyche is incredibly plastic. Even in the most crystallized cases, there is always a crack where light can enter. It just takes one decision, just one small movement in the opposite direction of what you have always done. And from that movement, others become possible. The question that remains, and that you need to ask yourself with complete honesty, is simple. Are you getting to know yourself, or just hiding inside yourself? Are you using your introversion as a tool for depth, or as an excuse to never confront what you fear most? Are you silent because you have deep things to contemplate, or because you gave up on everything outside of you? These questions deserve to be answered, and no one can answer them for you. Not this video, not Jung, not anyone, only you, in the silent and honest encounter with yourself. But this time, a true encounter. Not the rumination disguised as self-knowledge. An encounter that hurts, that frees, that transforms. And if this content touched something deep in you, if you felt that these words reached some corner of your soul that needed to hear exactly this, then do this. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery with us, and consider joining our membership club, where we dive even deeper into these questions that shape who we are. Your presence here, on the other side of the screen, is part of what gives this work its meaning.